Hello and welcome to the Scanlon Leadership Interview Series, sponsored by the Scanlon Leadership Network and Foundation. I'm your host, Ron Duffy. In these interviews, you'll meet successful business leaders and entrepreneurs who talk about what it takes to become a great leader and share their experiences building effective organizations with a Scanlon plan. A Scanlon plan is an innovative leadership process for total organization development. It consists of a set of assumptions about human motivation and behavior, general principles for management based on these assumptions, and specific procedures for implementing these principles. The Scanlon Leadership Network is a nonprofit association of high-performance, values-led organizations founded by Joe Scanlon and Dr. Carl Frost. Joe Scanlon was a steelworker and MIT lecturer who in the 1950s pioneered some of the first high-performance work systems based on the revolutionary idea that the average employee wants to work and has great creativity if given the opportunity. Dr. Frost carried on Scanlon's work at Michigan State University, conducting research and installing Scanlon plans. Member organizations have won the Baldrige Award, the Shingo Prize, hundreds of supplier awards, and 5 have been ranked in the top 50 best places to work in North America. The Scanlon Leadership Network is considered one of the best-kept secrets in American business. The Scanlon Leadership Network and Foundation brings this series of interviews to you as a public service to help leaders create better organizations for workers, consumers, and investors. Scanlon, where the best ideas come together. Our guest today is Myron Marsh, President and CEO of Thomson-Shore Incorporated, located in Dexter, Michigan. Thomson-Shore is a short-run book manufacturer serving trade, professional, university, and religious publishing markets. Myron Marsh has been CEO of Thomson-Shore for 6 years. Prior to that, he was Vice President Manufacturing of a multinational company producing machine components for the plastics industry. Myron is also the chairman of the board of directors of the Scanlon Leadership Network. He has been involved with the Scanlon Leadership Network for more than 20 years. Myron Marsh has worked for 3 different Scanlon Plan companies, witnessing both organizational growth and decline when the company abandoned the Scanlon principles. Given this unique background, I asked Myron to share his insights and lessons learned on what it takes to be successful implementing a Scanlon plan in an organization. To start the interview, I asked Myron to talk about his early career choices and how these experiences shaped his views about leadership.
Thanks, Ron. In preparing for this, really had to do some searching in my own history to try to realize how I've come by this journey. And I look back, I started out not even intending to go to college, but to be a skilled tradesman, and I started as a tool and die maker for Caterpillar Tractor Company in the Midwest. And, I was exposed to probably the wrong kind of leadership at that time, and it was the what we call the command and control model. And it was in the late 60s, and I was pretty young, 18 years old. It just didn't feel right, and I didn't have a good first work experience. It was over 5,000 employees in the company I worked at. It was way too big for me. I had to go on a fallback position, which I'd had a great teacher in high school that had encouraged me to likewise become a vocational education teacher. So I abandoned my first goal of being a tool and die maker and went to college to indeed become a shop teacher. That was a good move on my part because I started to be exposed to things that now I have terminology for, but back then I didn't. I had a very collegial first boss after I got out of college that involved me and didn't dictate to me how to do things, and right out of school respected my opinion as he thought I was on equal par to a 30-year instructor. So I really started feeling good, and I wasn't making parallels to that in my first job experience, but later on I started to see how you engage people in work can make a real difference.
Well, Myron, thanks for sharing some of your early career influences. Now I'm going to lead you and our listeners into your work experience with 3 different Scanlon companies. The first one we're going to talk about is the time you spent working for Tokheim. Am I saying the name right?
That's correct.
Okay, and I'll say a brief bit of background about Tokheim Corporation. It's about 1,700 employees. At the time you were working there, it was 1,700 employees in 7 different U.S. plant locations. Basically, they made gas pumps for service stations. At the time you started working for Tokheim, it was not yet a Scanlon Plan company. You started at Tokheim as a corporate manager of training and development, which kind of built on your previous work experience, and then you were moved into a plant manager role at one of the various plants. And you worked there for approximately 11 years and held 7 to 8 different positions, and certainly we don't have time in this interview to talk about each position in the whole 11 years. So what we're going after here is kind of the overview of your experience at Tokheim, what the Scanlon Plan did for the company, and some specific stories that kind of illustrate the power of Scanlon. So having said that, let's start with, prior to having a Scanlon Plan implemented at Tokheim, can you describe the problems Tokheim was facing?
Tokheim, at the time I joined, was actually experiencing some very severe labor problems. They had had 3 consecutively worse strikes, and relationships between management and labor, in particular their largest facility in Fort Wayne, Indiana, was continually getting worse, to the extent that management was trying to separate themselves from this environment by actually opening up more satellite plants and moving work out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. So it was sort of a downward spiral that the company was going in.
If that spiral continued, it's fairly safe to say that the business might have gone under.
The business might have gone under, but certainly the people that worked at the home base in Fort Wayne would have been affected, because they were in the process of losing jobs and seeing them go elsewhere. They were holding on to anything they could do to stop that, which turned into things like strikes and work stoppages.
Unbeknownst to you at the time, some of the senior management at Tokheim was aware of these issues and said, we've got to find a way to work with the UAW and the other, that's United Auto Workers Union.
Yes.
And some other unions that were involved with Tokheim, and they were saying, we have to find a way to work together or we're all in big trouble. Is that accurate?
Yes, and what we're describing is kind of a big picture that, I was off doing assignments and training and recruitment and helping to open up satellite plants, and I really was not involved in any of the strategy and some of these big picture things. I knew they were going on, but often I was out of town doing something else. I knew that senior management was meeting with the union and trying to figure out what they were going to do, and what they were going to do was some kind of a joint program that would bring them back together. And I know that in this joint process, they started going out and looking at things like Scanlon plans. There were 2 consultants at the time that were implementing Scanlon plans. One was Fred LeSueur, and it was pretty much a bonus-driven type of Scanlon plan. And then there was Carl Frost and Bill Greenwood, who had a consulting company, and they were implementing a Scanlon plan that followed a roadmap for change. And I know that UAW leadership and company management looked at the 2 processes. They decided that they needed more than just a bonus plan, and so they acquired Dr. Frost and Dr. Greenwood to help Tokheim implement a Scanlon plan.
Myron, you were part of a group of about 30 people from across the different plants, from different departments in the company, that were part of the lead group to implement a Scanlon plan?
I didn't know much about it at the time, but Dr. Greenwood showed up along with members of management and started having meetings at each of our facilities explaining what Scanlon plans were. You know, it really was a roadmap that he was helping the organization follow, and part of that was to find out if there was an interest and actually that people perceived there was need to change, that we actually needed to change the way we were doing things. If we needed to change, would we be committed to a change? And so he was asking this question of employees, and ultimately it led to would you be willing to help develop a new process that would help the organization change? And we put together teams of about 30 employees in something that was called an ad hoc team. And this 30-employee team was divided into three groups, one that worked on communications, one that worked on participation systems, and one that worked on equity. It was a diagonal cross-section of the organization. So we had operators and first-level employees from 7 different plants, and we had management people and salespeople and people that worked in office administrative functions, accountants. So this 30-person team, large team, really represented the entire company. And I was a plant manager and the only plant manager that was on the team, and I guess I kind of represented that particular piece of the employee demographics.
Is there anything that might help our listeners understand the early part of implementing a Scanlon plan, which is to go through the roadmap? Would there be any benefit to mentioning some of the steps of the roadmap or not?
There are, if people would maybe listen to Dr. Greenwood's podcast. He really does a great job of thoroughly describing that roadmap. I can certainly attest to having lived those steps at Tokheim Corporation. In very brief, to get it started, management had to decide what needed to be changed in the organization and be open to that, and they had to articulate the reality of today's business to all employees, and that became a mandate to drive change. And that was turned over to the ad hoc committee and said, look, if this is what our future needs to be about, how will we get there? And this was really an involvement effort for employees then. This diagonal team had to figure out, what kind of participation structures we would have, what kind of communication structures we would have. And if we made a difference, if we made improvements, how would we share in those improvements? Or if we didn't make improvements, how would we share in the bad times too? So that was the challenge that was given to the ad hoc committee.
In almost all of the Scanlon leadership interviews that I've done so far, the term "what day is it" comes up, and that's kind of the shorthand version of saying, do you really understand your business? Do you really know where you're competitive, where you're not competitive? Do you know where the future of the business is going? Do your employees know this? That's all kind of encompassed by trying to answer the question what day it is. Am I understanding that right?
That's correct, Ron, and it's just critically important to all of us that are Scanlon practitioners that we begin with this understanding reality piece, because it's a belief in people. People will do the right thing. They will figure out what to do if they really understand reality, and reality is saying, what day is it? And if we understand that we're losing customers because of something, if we understand that plants are closing because we're disrupting flow of product to customers, if we really understand that, then we'll probably figure out the right thing to do to fix it.
I'm going to move us into some of the results that Tokheim experienced with the Scanlon plan. So, we're talking about several months now from the time you're first exposed to the Scanlon plan process that it takes to get senior management on board, to understand what's expected of senior management. Then this information is rolled out to mid-managers, and then it's also rolled out to the employee for a vote saying, will you participate? Will you commit to this? The key Scanlon principles that are built throughout this that'll probably come up in the conversation, maybe I'll ask you to say them, Myron.
Sure. This whole process, in the Tokheim case, it took over a year from the standpoint of getting the ad hoc committee together and then actually having a plan that we could roll out to employees and ask that they accept the plan. And in that time, that's when relationships started to mend and people started to come back together again. on this ad hoc committee, you actually had 3 different unions represented, and then you had non-union employees. And we were very fractured when we first came together. But the fact that we were actually working on developing a course for our future brought people together. And then that started to transfer into our daily work. So the biggest thing that happened during the development was fences were being mended and people were coming back together. After we actually implemented this plan and process, those kinds of relationships continue to build. And so if we had problem-solving sessions, we had to pull together people from different plants to work on fixing something, we were much more likely to succeed at that than what was happening before Scanlon.
So I'm going to try to summarize that for you, Myron. Here's what I'm getting. Let's use the Tolkheim example. It was about a year of development of the Scanlon plan process. So for people who are listening to this, business leaders, workers at an organization considering Scanlon, and you're thinking whether you're going to do this, somebody might say, you mean it took a whole year before we actually started to improve something because that was just the development? I think what you're saying to me, the response is that's not an accurate way to look at this. That development time actually became the platform, or Myron, your words, our operating system for how we can get improvement, because we were building relationships, building a knowledge base about how to do servant leadership, learning concepts about principles, and all these things is like fertilizing the ground that allows a plant to bloom. In this analogy, the plants blooming are the actual teams that take on issues, that come up with improvements that lead to better performance and better equity for the better profits for the company. Have I said that fairly?
Absolutely. I think many of the people that were involved in this said we made our most dramatic improvement before we ever even implemented the plan and the process. There were so many other things that were going on. People were developing competencies to communicate. We were working together to get messages across. I was changing. I was starting to all of a sudden see people that I saw as adversaries, as part of the mechanism to make a difference, how we would actually change going forward and be successful. There were all kinds of little humorous stories that would take place during this time. We were taking people that were hardline, first-line supervisors that had only managed in one way in the past, where they went out and they made the work assignments and you did what they said, and at the end of the day you went home. And we were changing that, asking them to have team meetings with employees and get their input. And I'll never forget that I had employees of probably one of our toughest supervisors on third shift tell me one time, they said, I don't know what you're doing with Joe, but this guy he's changing. He's having meetings with us, and we're being asked to do different things now, and I don't know what you guys are doing, but he's changing. Well, it wasn't but half an hour after I talked to employees, the supervisor comes up and he says, I tell you, I don't know what we're doing with this Scanlon process, but my employees are changing. They are actively involved in making improvements in the plant. Look at this suggestion I just got from somebody to make this change. It's going to save us 4 hours in a setup that we've been doing for the last 20 years. That's just one of the examples of how things started to move forward. At the same time, we were very fortunate when we implemented the plan, because another change that occurred were bonuses that people hadn't achieved before. So all of a sudden there were also dollars that were coming in as a result of improvements in business that people had not experienced. And that started to get other folks' attention that maybe were the naysayers and didn't really think something would happen. And then when they started getting checks, I can remember people on the ad hoc committee going around and saying, if you want to endorse your check over to me because I know you said this would never happen, I'd be happy to take that money off your hands.
That's a cute story. You mentioned a personal story about your own work at the Fort Wayne plant with the UAW union head.
I remember the head of the union and our controller at the time going face-to-face in a meeting with each other's, pointing the finger in each other's face. And arguing out some point that had to do with a small detail and how a bonus plan would be structured. And I can remember from that process, though, that that's a perfect example of a relationship being formed. In the past, those two would argue, but it was at the negotiating table, and there was all kinds of politics involved in negotiation, positioning, and lack of information sharing. And it was just the opposite in this example. Each was trying to make sure that the other person understood what was behind their position so that they could somehow find the right middle ground. And all of a sudden it was a win-win versus this lose-lose that I had seen in the past. And, it was from that then that future things that came up, 3-4 months down the road, a question would come up. There was actually trust now where two people could go to each other and talk and answer questions, and that hadn't happened before.
There's a couple of quotes here I'm going to ask you to respond to, and then we're going to move on to what happened at Tolkheim that ended a Scanlon plan. This is one quote I'd ask you to respond to, Myron. Doing Scanlon versus doing our work. This paradigm must be broken.
That's something that has stayed with me throughout my years with Scanlon. It's something I learned at Tolkheim. We were so diligent with the process that I think in our organization we ended up with two things. We had our daily work to do, our regular jobs, and we had Scanlon to do. And that's really a problem when you end up with that, because people are trying to do two different things. And Scanlon needs to be a root system that helps you get the rest of the work done. It shouldn't be something that you have to go off and do. It's just a process that helps you do, whether it's working with a team of people that need to change an accounting process, or working with getting engineers and people on the shop floor to come up with something that's going to work best for the customer. It's a process that's underneath. It's not something you have to say, oh, I have to go do some Scanlon meetings now, or I have to turn in a Scanlon suggestion. We're thinking the wrong way when that happens.
There's one other quote here, and you were talking about Scanlon meetings made up of cross-functional groups and what goes on in those meetings, and this was your quote. It's these kinds of things in these meetings of cross-functional teams that I see the power of Scanlon being released.
Well, I think it's true in any setting where you can really get people to open up and be creative, that you'll come up with the best possible solution. And it's when, the old command and control, when one person comes in and there's going to be the rest of us sitting around looking at that one person's idea and saying, nah, it isn't going to work. But it's when the whole group can come together and look at it, and they build off of one another's ideas. The synergy just overwhelms what one person's thought is, and you come up with such an improved solution. I see that over and over again in the Scanlon process, where we tap the potential of several people at one time.
I'm going to try to summarize something. It just came to me as I listened to your story just a few minutes ago about the union head and the controller, was it?
Yes.
As you told me how they were obviously trying to work together and make sure they understood the rationale for their points of view, in my mind I flipped back to the four main Scanlon principles of the first one being, what day is it? Do you know your business? Do you know the problems? Do you know where we're headed or what we're trying to achieve? What do we need to do to remain competitive? And in a sense, those two are trying to help each other understand what day it is from their particular perspective as they had to work together. And then the other principles, participation. There's clearly participation in new ways that's happening, and that interaction you described as an example of that. Ultimately, another Scanlon principle is the equity principle. Are the shareholders, the employees, and the customers all kept in balance here in a way so that we can be most effective? Jump in if I'm misstating something. Ultimately, if the fruits of their interactions becomes good, the profit of the company is going to improve. And then competence. As you learn these processes, as you learn to work in new ways, you do need to develop new ways of working, and that is competence. So just for our listeners to understand, those are kind of the groundwork that's almost behind any Scanlon conversation. Would you agree with that?
I would agree, and you can take it right to that discussion and say that's exactly what they were hammering out. They were understanding each other's point of view and understanding what their reality was that they were working on. There was clearly participation. At the end of it, there was a test of ownership. Do they both own what the solution's going to be? And then are we going to be accountable to it? And that's a piece, that's a process of equity. And their competency was being raised at the very time that the two of them were figuring out how to work together.
I'm Ron Duffy, and we are talking with Myron Marsh, current CEO of Thomson-Shore Incorporated, a short-run book manufacturer. Myron has worked for 3 different Scanlon plan companies, witnessing both organizational growth and decline when the company abandoned the Scanlon principles. In this interview, I asked Myron to share his insights on what it takes to be successful implementing a Scanlon plan in an organization. I'm going to move us on now to what happened at Tokheim. You had 5 years of improvements under a Scanlon plan, and then we don't live in a perfect world, and in this case, the Scanlon plan died at Tokheim. And would you take us through why that happened?
Well, I think it's a good lesson in Scanlon and probably similar systems is they're very dependent upon leadership. And if leadership changes and somebody else steps in and that's not what they feel, believe, it's not a process they want to use, it's going to go away. And that's what happened at Tokheim. There was a change at the top. The person that was 100% committed to this process left the organization. From there, I can vividly remember sitting on a couch in the new president's office with Bill Greenwood and organization development person that worked for me, and we were debating and arguing about how you kill Scanlon, because if this wasn't going to be the president's way of operating, it would be unfair for our organization to live through this slow and painful death of faking that we were committed to this process. We actually did make the decision that we were going to announce that the plan was going to be discontinued.
In a previous conversation, Myron, you said to me that you reported to 4 different presidents at Tokheim within 1 year, which is probably indicative of massive change happening in the organization and a rudderless sort of approach, and Scanlon couldn't flourish in that without. The main point here is if you don't have top leadership support of Scanlon, it's not going to work. Is that accurate?
That's correct, and that's over some course of time. That's when I actually had to make a personal decision to move on, that things weren't going to change, was when I reported to 4 presidents in 1 year. It was pretty clear that we weren't going to move forward. And it's a very sad situation because that continued to lead to a 15 years of downward spiral. And when you talk about equity, everybody got hurt in the end. Shareholders were hurt because along the way the company was delisted from the New York Stock Exchange and share value plummeted. The company was restructured and went through bankruptcy and ultimately was broken up. Employees lost jobs, they lost benefits, they lost retirement plans, they lost careers. The community lost a significant employer. Customers suffered because they couldn't get their equipment serviced. So it was just a total loss, and it's so sad to see a 100-plus year company go down that road.
It almost sounds like a poster child for what not to do in terms of business principles and practices.
And I will add something else that happened that I did recognize at that time is, in spite of saying you're going to pull the plug on Scanlon, there's an inertia factor. And that was built up. It's like spinning a big wheel. That we started spinning that wheel when the ad hoc committee was formed, and then the momentum continued to gain on that. And at the time that there was a change in leadership at the top, things at the top started to unwind, but the rest of the organization was still, benefiting from relationships that had been formed in the early part. So there were several years there that we continued to have some pretty good relationships, and people were genuinely trying to make this thing work.
Okay, thank you for sharing your experience at Tolkheim. I'm going to move us on now to your experience at Exaloy Corporation. I'm going to, in a brief way, try to state your background there so I can move us into the meat of the Scanlon experiences there. Correct me, Myron, if I'm not saying things right. Exaloy Corporation is involved with making plastic cylinders.
Let me help you right there, because it's actually a big machining operation. The facility I was in, which was in Southwest Virginia, and they make these big metal cylinders with a hard surface inside them that is used in plastic machinery that produces plastic parts, everything from bumpers to CDs. So it's a big machining operation is primarily what they do.
Thank you. So you take a job with Exaloy. Part of the reason you took a job there is because they were already committed to a Scanlon plan process way of doing business.
That's correct, because I just came off of a failure at Tokheim, and I wanted to work in a Scanlon environment.
Why don't you take it from there, the background, a little bit of the background, and then I'll ask you a question to get us into what happened.
Well, Exaloy had a Scanlon plan. It was functioning. It matched my interests in continuing to work in manufacturing and manufacturing environment. So I took a position in this facility in Southwest Virginia, pretty much as the plant manager and head of manufacturing. My predecessor had implemented a number of changes in the organization that were not too favorable to the employees, and had really lost some of his leadership with that group and left the organization. And so as a commitment to Scanlon, they were interested in somebody that had experience in Scanlon, and I was interested in a company that was committed to the Scanlon process. And they had a Scanlon plan that had an interesting renewal feature to it, and it was that at the end of 3 years, the Scanlon plan would terminate, and it would be necessary to start all over again, create a new one if the employees wanted that, and repeat that cycle. So they were compelled at the end of, say, 2 years to go back in, form a group similar to the ad hoc group that was at Tokheim, analyze what worked, what changes they needed to make, and then take that plan back to employees for a vote. And if the employees voted with a higher than 80% commitment, then the plan was implemented. A perfect opportunity for me coming into the organization was to lead this renewal process, because it allowed me to, again, be a part of an organization, kind of a bonding process and understanding people, establishing communications patterns with folks that I wouldn't typically have, because, again, you have this diagonal cross-section that's working on something that's not directly getting a product out on a given day, but has a lot to do with the business in general. So it was a perfect opportunity to get started.
Myron, I'd like to get us sharing some of the Scanlon successes and stories at Exaloy. And you had about roughly a 10-year run there of the Scanlon plan process?
I was there approximately that amount of time, yes. I'm very proud of Exaloy. I think they're an excellent company. Then one of the things I'm very proud of is the fact that they became a world-class manufacturer using lean production principles. I don't think they could have possibly have done that if they didn't have this Scanlon process underlying how they approach things to implement lean. And I can give you one example about the change that occurred at Exaloy. You know, when I got there, it was a typical machine shop, heavy machinery with metal cutting chips and fluid flying off of machines and smoke in the air, and bare concrete floors that had lots of cracks in them from things that had dropped on the floor over a 30-year period. And about the time we decided we would implement lean, we had brought in somebody to help teach us. And I remember him walking through the plant, looking around, and walking up to one of our operators who was running something called an EDM machine, and it has a lot of coolant and fluid, and it splashes all over the floor. And there was this all of this absorbent material that was on the floor where to dry up the oil, you just throw this dirty powder on the floor. This fellow walked up, that was from outside of Exeloy, walked up to our operator and said, "Do you like cats?" And the operator said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And he said, "You must really enjoy cats because you're working in this environment that's surrounded by kitty litter. It's all over the place. You can't walk without getting your shoes dirty." The operator just kind of like grinned, and I remember this fellow took a picture of it because it became one of our before pictures at Exeloy. This is what we looked like as we started to make process improvements. To put a cap on that story, about 3 years later, the whole image of the company has changed. The floors are sealed and the lights are brighter. There's no coolant on the floors, and the operators mop the floors at the end of every shift, and it's just a totally different environment. And we have a lot of visitors coming through the plant to try to understand what it is we did and how we made these improvements. And we had one of our Japanese customers come in. I think he was from Toshiba at the time, and he walked up to me and he was pretty impressed with the plant, and he said, "Myron-san, could you tell me what the 5 S's are in English, because I need to know." And I said, "The 5 S's?" And I said, you must know the 5 S's. And I rattled them off in Japanese, seri, seiso, seitan, shitsuki. He said, no, stop, Myron. He says, "No, I need them in English." And I said, "English? You mean like we call them sort, shine, straighten, standardize, sustain?" And he said, yes, I need those. Please write them down for me. And I wrote them down, and I asked him, I said, "What do you need these for?" And he says, "Oh, we have a plant in California. It is a very messy, disorganized plant, and I need to teach these people the same processes you're using." So I think it was quite a compliment for the organization to go from this kitty litter-infested, dirty, dark plant to a plant where Japanese managing directors coming in and asking for us to help give them some guidance on how they can improve one of their own operations.
Thank you for sharing that story. Did I hear one of the lessons of that story is that you practiced a set of improvement principles called lean manufacturing? Is that right, at Exeloy? And probably the practice of lean manufacturing is part of why that story occurred. And I'm assuming the 5 S's are part of a lean technology. And so here's where I'm going, though. I think you've said to me, Myron, that if we didn't at Exeloy understand the Scanlon principles and processes and have that as our operating system, have that as the fundamental values and bedrock in us about how we do business, you could have the best lean tools in the world, and they might be useless to you.
That's exactly right. I just see it as the basis for being able to make change successful in an organization. The Exeloy case, we had a Scanlon process. The Scanlon process was working. People knew how to participate. We practiced the identity principle rigorously. They knew that we had to change the way we were doing things. We had to be a world-class manufacturer, that we had to constantly take costs out to be competitive with the people around the world that were trying to take our jobs away from us. The process to get there was to teach employees a set of tools of lean production and how to remove waste from our operations. Scanlon was running in the background. I think when I've seen other companies try to implement lean, they stumble, and the reason they stumble is they don't have that basis from which to make their implementation.
You shared with me a story about a person from Germany who was a consultant. Does that fit here?
Yeah, when we were first implementing lean, we were trying to find people that could teach this, and I don't think there were a lot of consultants at the time, but we had a internal person who was German, and he was one of the first people certified by the Japanese body that do this as a lean consultant. And he came in and he spent a couple of days with us. We learned from that experience that there's 2 ways of implementing lean. One is kind of a mandated approach where you come in and you immediately tell people to start moving equipment around and changing this, and they have to work in a new world order as a result of of these quick changes that take place. That didn't fly very well at Exeloy. In fact, after day number one, the second day rolled around, and when this consultant came in with some of his colleagues, there was a huge American flag that had been put up on the wall behind one of the operator's machines, just kind of declaring that, this is a different country here and we do things differently. And it could have just as easily been a Scanlon flag, I think, because we saw that we were violating some principles that we held near and dear to our heart. So there were several members of management, myself included, that was in the president's office right after that saying, we agree with the principle in which we're trying to move forward, which is we need to remove waste from the operation, but we're not following our own culture, heritage, our Scanlon principles in doing it. So we need to step back and find another way to get lean implemented.
Thank you for sharing that story. So how you do something has as much to do with its success as what you're actually doing, I think, is part of that.
That's correct. And again, since we're talking about Scanlon and Scanlon cases here, it's just a constant reminder that you have to be working those principles. And one of those principles is if you know what day it is and you know that a disorderly workplace is getting in your way and people understand that, then you have to engage them in participating on and making a change. You can't come in and just mandate it. You've got to get them to understand the reason for and the need to change, and then let them participate in how they're going to go about making that change.
So the old style of management that we're not too fond of is titled command and control, or command and edict. I get a sense of Scanlon plan process. Correct me if these aren't right terms, but it might be ask, involve, and review.
That would definitely work. And maybe this is the right place to tell this story, but through these experiences with Scanlon companies, I've really come to believe that it's managing by principle as opposed to managing by edict or managing by policy or managing by procedure. That's going to get you the greatest distance. I've really, through the years, committed myself to this management by principle. And if you're going to manage by principle, then the principles I choose are the principles of identity and the education to accomplish identity, the principle of participation, and the process is ownership to get the participation, the principle of equity, the process of accountability to assure equity, and the principle of competence and the process of commitment that's necessary to achieve competence. Those are the principles, and I think when you can rely on principles, you will know in your head and your heart what you need to do to correct any situation or move anything forward. It's when you have to rely on a policy manual or a procedure book or a union contract that all of a sudden things start to become dehumanized.
I think you've been saying this. There is a phrase that I think you told me was actually said by somebody else, but does this kind of summarize what you're sharing with us right now? This quote, "The soft skills are the hard skills."
Yeah, that's a pretty good phrase, and I hear that among the lean practitioners because, lean is a bag full of tools. It's things called total productive maintenance, overall operating equipment effectiveness, value stream mapping, all of these different devices that you can use in an organization to help eliminate and remove waste and improve the products that you deliver to customers and the service for customers. That's what lean is about. And I think it's much easier to go out and learn those skills, learn something that's called 5S and what the 5S's are and how to do it and deploy it. That's easy. The hard thing are the Scanlon skills. Fortunately for us, the people that are familiar with Scanlon and work in these organizations, we have a roadmap, we have a process that helps us, and we have a discipline that says, do you know what day it is? You can wake up at 3 a.m. with somebody on the telephone that says, we got a problem in the plant. You just automatically go through this drill of, well, what day is it? What do you mean the toilets aren't flushing? Okay, well, what are we going to do about it? And who's participating in solving the problem? It just rolls through a set of principles. I don't have to go find a manual or make something up. I've got a process that helps me get there.
Thank you, Myron. I have a couple other quotes now that came up as we discussed your knowledge about Scanlon Plan and your experience at Exaloy. I'm going to say these two quotes, and I think there's something that binds them together. I'm going to say that, and then I'm going to ask you to tell a story. Here's the two quotes. Stick to the principles, and the solution will work for your organization. So you've been talking about that to us now. Now here's a second quote. You can't copy another Scanlon company's plan. The problems and solutions are unique. If I've heard you accurately, you're saying be principle-driven, and if you are true to the principles, no matter what you face, you're going to find a solution and a way of dealing with it that'll work for your organization, and it's not cookie cutter. We can't take it off the shelf from some other company. There's a story you told me about Exelon, about the cartoons, and I thought, if there's ever a story about uniqueness, this is it. Would you share that with us? And does it relate to this business about you can't copy another Scanlon plan?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. And maybe just before we jump into that, I think this piece about every company is a little bit different. You really have to trust these principles and these processes, and if you follow them, you'll come up with the solution for your organization. Having worked in 3 now, I can attest that the way you approach these principles has to be different in each organization, because each organization has its own culture, and you need to respect that. You're not going to go in and change that culture overnight. The example that we're kind of laughing about is that at Exaloy, everybody has different ways of approaching accountability, and I've never seen this in an organization. But one of my fondest memories from Exaloy is a book of cartoons that I've kept with me and I've taken away from that experience with that organization. They literally use cartoons as an accountability tool. It wasn't by design. It was just part of the culture that evolved. And the use of the cartoons, the way that would work is if somebody did something that, it wasn't quite right, it was a mistake, or you needed to call them on it. One way of doing it was to draw a cartoon of the individual and the example they were going through and post it throughout the plant. And everyone got the message. And I can give you one example. We had a water pit out behind the plant. You periodically had to go out and replace spray bars and part of the equipment, clean it, take the pumps out. There was something wrong with the spray bars one day, and I walked out, and one of our maintenance guys was creating a raft. And he was going to try to stand on this raft and float himself out to the spray bar that wasn't working. And, of course, this water is heated water, too, and it's not water you'd want to fall into. And I had to call him over and say, I don't think that's the right way we're going to do that. And no sooner than I could get back in the plant, somebody's already drawing a cartoon of this maintenance guy standing out on a raft, me standing beside the pit with a lifesaver that I'm going to throw it to him to save him. And, then he gets all this harassment from his fellow employees about, did you really do that? Why did you do that? It's just another way of holding each other accountable. And I've never seen the process used anywhere else like that.
In the interest of time, I'm going to shortly move us on to your experience at Thomson-Shore. Let's touch on the ending of the Scanlon plan at Exaloy. And here's the background as you've told it to me. You went through this 3-year renewal process with Scanlon about 3 different times, so that must be about a 9-year period. Then the business climate just went south. The capital equipment market went bad. Wages had to be frozen. Some people were laid off. At the 3rd renewal, the employees had to vote on renewing the Scanlon plan. You needed an 80% acceptance, and it got 78%. So the Scanlon plan ended at Exaloy. Have I said things accurately?
That's correct. And I think, one of the learning things I've received from that was that probably, participation and voting up front to explore a Scanlon process makes sense. But to try to define an acceptance level to continue a process is dangerous, because in the Exaloy situation, 78% of the employees, that's a pretty significant group of people that still wanted to continue with this process. And so now there's a limited number of people that have an axe to grind for whatever reason. It likely doesn't have to do directly with the plan and the way the plan works, but it's, they want to get management's attention for something, that are repeatedly voting no. It's not a good way to have to end a plan.
In Exeloy's case, they didn't have the tragic ending story of Tokheim where the company disbanded.
No, and I think that's, again, there's another example of maybe how the two correlate. The leadership at the top of the company didn't change at Exeloy. The president that very much believed in the Scanlon principles is still there. At the time I was there, he was working pretty much out of Switzerland, and at the end was not involved in the day-to-day Virginia plant operations. But he's remained there, and through this down period in the capital equipment market, management and private equity bought the company from the Swiss owners, and it's kind of been restructured, but the Virginia plant still exists. And I can't help but think that the principles, even though they're not saying that they have a Scanlon plan, those principles are still somewhat practiced because the leader is still there.
You're listening to the Scanlon Leadership Interview Series. I'm Ron Duffy, and we are talking with Myron Marsh, current CEO of Thomson-Shore Incorporated, a short-run book manufacturer. Myron has worked for 3 different Scanlon plan companies, witnessing both organizational growth and decline when the company abandoned the Scanlon principles. In this interview, I asked Myron to share his insights on what it takes to be successful implementing a Scanlon plan in an organization. Myron, I'd like us to move on to your work experience and experience with the Scanlon improvement process at your current company where you're the CEO, Thomson-Shore Incorporated. You're the current CEO. You've been there about 6 years. It's approximately 260 employees. It's an employee stock ownership plan company. Thomson-Shore is a book manufacturer. I'd like you to add whatever else you'd like to say about Thomson-Shore. From that, then, I'm going to ask you to talk about how you approach the Scanlon plan differently at Thomson-Shore from the experience that you had at Exeloy.
Thomson-Shore is an interesting company. It was founded by Ned Thompson and Harry Shore. They had worked for another book manufacturer, and they did not have a good experience there, and they decided that they wanted a good place to work. They had a belief that if you take care of employees and you take care of customers, you'll have a clear conscience at the end of the day. And that's really, that and the golden rule was the basis of which they started the company, and it's 35 years old now. And along the way, with that kind of a philosophy, they discovered Scanlon. They were a Scanlon organization before I joined. I have a personal passion for books. I love manufacturing. So combining Scanlon with a product that I love was just a natural for me, and it was an opportunity now to finally be the top person that believes in Scanlon in an organization that can try to make it work on all cylinders.
I'd like you to share with us some of the specific stories that happened, success stories that involve improvements at Thomson-Shore that can be related to your Scanlon way of doing business. I guess I'll ask you to start with one that I found very interesting. It's the story of your capital equipment purchase story. Could you share that with us?
When I joined Thomson-Shore, one of the things that in the recruitment process they were interested in was whether I could bring some more formal processes to the organization. With the experience already in Scanlon, it made sense to try to have processes that supported Scanlon. One of the things at Thomson-Shore is it's capital intensive. So we have some pretty sophisticated equipment, huge printing presses that cost, well over $1 million a piece, binding lines that cost $2 and $3 million. And when these need to be replaced or you need new technology, Those are huge expenses. Scanlon says that you need to involve people in that. And so when we go out and we look at procuring equipment, we do so by involving the employees that are going to operate the equipment. So if the equipment is in Germany or Italy, that's where our people go to look at, review. We just recently had purchased a case binding line, and we sent operators to Germany with some of the toughest jobs that we run in the plant to actually run on the equipment and to prove it out. When they come back, they're going to be part of, or were part of, the approval process for the capital equipment. We do not buy any capital without the people that operate the capital having some kind of review and sign off on the equipment. And I think that's just one more wise example of how you can take policy and process and combine it with Scanlon principles.
I'm going to move us on to another story that I just found absolutely fascinating. Thomson-Shore, your company, the employees, won an award for eliminating performance appraisal. Would you take us through that story?
Well, I think that's what's fun about having your own company, and also a company that employees own, is you don't have to follow everybody else's rules. You have to figure out what's right for your organization and take action. I think the feeling was that performance appraisal is counterproductive. In fact, if you read what Deming says about performance appraisals, he was very opposed to it, and he said that it leaves people bitter, dejected, and depressed, and I think that's often true. Managers don't like doing them. They consider it to be additional work and often don't put the time into it that they need to put into it, or the heart into it that they need to. Employees usually see it as some kind of a slap or miscommunications, and then at the end it's usually tied to a compensation system, and that's what we're most interested in, is how does it affect our pay and why I didn't get the raise that I wanted to get. So we just felt it was a huge waste of time, and we really ought to be doing something that was developmental and helpful to one another. So we took the time that we were putting into performance appraisal and really put it into a feedback system that employees could use with one another, and the amount of time we invested in education to help people give and receive feedback. That's where we made our investment.
You changed performance appraisal and got rid of what wasn't working and kept the piece that was valuable, the feedback piece, and then you separated the compensation from that whole appraisal situation.
Well, when you attack the performance appraisal system, then you really had to address the compensation system too, and that at Thomson-Shore wasn't working very well either. We had a compensation system that we kind of called it far exceeds, because you tried to get a far exceeds rating, because then you could get the highest amount of pay individually. So what you had was you were creating a lot of individualists that were really trying to get their pay to the highest level, and it was really working contrary to what a team environment should be about. We looked at compensation and said, really, we're going to pay market wages for people. We want our people to be able to perform all the elements of their job, get their market rate, and then as we as an organization do well, our equity piece is we're going to receive, first off, our share value as shareholders will increase, and secondly, if we hit all the numbers, then we have the opportunity for a bonus. And so that's the above and beyond. It's not doled out to individuals on a far exceeds basis.
This next story I'm asking you to tell is another example of the uniqueness of a Scanlon plan at a particular company. And this is the story of the Equity Cafe. Would you please share with us that this is a team working on an issue. Again, I'm assuming it's a cross-sectional or cross-functional team studying an issue, being asked to participate, being involved, and what do they come up with?
Well, we have a Scanlon committee at Thomson-Shore, and they recognized that we had some morale issues in the plant and we should do something about it. So they formed a subcommittee of people that were interested in working on the issue. It kind of became the equity renewal team. Their charge was to go off and try to understand what the problem was and recommend some solution. They did several things, but the most creative piece that they came up with is recognizing that often in morale situations and things where people are pointing to equity or fairness as being the root problem, this group said, well, it's the accountability issue and understanding accountability and the communications that goes with it where I think we're missing the boat. There's rumors that get started. We don't have accurate information to stop the rumors. So let's come up with a way of doing a better job of communicating and involving people in that. So they came up with something called the Equity Cafe, which is an intranet-based system. All of our people at Thomson-Shore have access to computers, whether they're out in a plant or working in an office environment. They can easily click on this Equity Cafe and submit a question. And it's submitted anonymously, and it goes to one of the people that were on the original committee. They're called baristas because they serve up the questions to the people that need to answer them. They do this as kind of a sideline to their job. A question comes in, and then they figure out who should best answer it in the organization, and we're committed to getting an answer in 48 hours. Sometimes we may go a little longer than that because it actually requires some outside research, but most of the questions are quickly answered, and if they're not, the baristas certainly hear about it. But the point is we're trying to get more accurate information to people. The other side piece of that is the accountability piece, because now all of a sudden you have a whole host of us that have to think in a different way because if we communicate a change to the organization, in the back of our minds we all of a sudden think, well, that's going to prompt a cafe question. So how can I head off the cafe question to start with? I've noticed that our managers are becoming a little more astute and paying more attention to the quality of the communications that they put out. As a reminder, is if we fail in communications, there surely will be a cafe question to answer.
The specific topic, as you were talking to me about the Equity Cafe as a communications device and solution, an example was workers were saying, gee, we've just had a slow week at work and I wanted some time off, but I didn't get it. Why is that? And there really was a very practical and needed business reasons why people couldn't take time off even though it had been a slow week. That's what the Equity Cafe answered, correct?
Yeah, that was a typical question, and I don't know how many hundreds of these we've done in the last year and a half, but we just recently, we had a slow week, and some people, the weather was beautiful, and some people wanted to take some time off, and evidently their supervisor didn't let them have that time off, so it prompted a question, and then the answer to the organization was, look, we have some cross-training that we have to do. We also have some work that's going to arrive later in the shift. These things all have to be considered before we can just have voluntary time off. And so that was the explanation back to the organization.
We have time for one more story. I'm thinking of the what you call the ESOP communications team, and perhaps I'd have you share a little bit about that, what their purpose is. ESOP stands for Employee Stock Ownership Plan?
Yes, it does.
And then recently, just before we decided to record this interview, you were sharing a story about a $3 million piece of equipment that related to ESOP at Thomson-Shore. I'd like you to kind of weave those things together if possible.
Just to back up just another step, Ned and Harry, when they created this company, when it was time for them to retire, and it's a Scanlon organization, they didn't want to just sell it to anybody. And here goes this leadership thing again, leadership changes and what's going to happen to the culture of the company. So their way out was to sell the company to the employees, and that was done through an ESOP. So it's nearly 100% employee-owned company. And one of the things we discovered was we didn't do a very good job of helping people understand what employee ownership is. And so we created this ESOP communications team. It's their mission to help educate their fellow employees, and they're developing a lot of competencies themselves about the complexity of ESOPs and ownership. The story we were talking about before we began this interview couple of weeks ago, we had one of our machine builder suppliers come in, and they had several people with them, and we were out in the plant touring. And the discussion came around to some of their maintenance mechanics had been servicing the equipment, and they said, your equipment is more than 2 years old, and it's in better condition than installations we've made in other companies that's only 6 months old. And we're trying to understand why it is. Every time we come in, it's better than when we left it. We see the workplace better organized, it's cleaner, you're making improvements to the equipment. What's different at Thomson-Shore? Because we need to help our other customers in sustaining their equipment and making these kinds of improvements. They quickly surmised that it was the employee ownership piece that made Thomson-Shore different, that maybe they should just advise their customers that, if you want to be like Thomson-Shore and you want your equipment to improve and last the way theirs does, you need to have owners and create an ESOP. And I had to kind of take them back to this operating system example we were talking about earlier, Ron, and that's where there's this whole system underneath, Scanlon, that's operating. And I think I've seen plenty of ESOPs where shares of stock are given to employees and they don't participate in the company, and you don't practice these other principles, it won't make a difference. And in those kinds of operations, an operator that's given a chance to improve a piece of equipment, it's going to shrug their shoulders and say, why should I? That's not my job. And the difference is it's all of these other pieces. It's the identity, it's the opportunity to participate, own, it's the piece of equity and the sharing, and it's their commitment to competence. It's those things together, again, that will make employee ownership work just like it will help lean practices or some other process you're trying to implement in the company work.
Thanks for sharing that story, Myron. I was, as you were sharing the story, I was just thinking, in a Scanlon company, for somebody to say, that's not my job or that's not my problem, probably is not language you're going to hear very often, or if you do hear it, somebody's going to jump in and say, well, that's not quite how we do things around here.
I think you're going to always hear it in some organization, but the interesting thing is I think the better the company is at deploying these principles, the more likely a peer or fellow employee is going to challenge that person and say, hey, this is my livelihood here. We don't do things this way.
Now I'm going to ask us to just do some summary overview of your entire life work experience with Scanlon and a couple of brief summary questions. Would you share your top 3 guiding principles on effective leadership / servant leadership?
I think the number one piece that has to go with this is that you have to have a belief in people. Everything we've talked about in this interview stems from first believing and trusting in people. If you value the human side of our coworkers, that's the starting point. The second thing is you have to understand this Frost definition of leadership, and that's that I'm only a leader if people will follow me. Leadership doesn't mean that they're going to follow me every day. It's if I'm really providing them the help to get them where they think they want to or need to go. Leadership is dictated by the followers, and I think you have to have that understanding. And then this piece we talked about earlier, which is management by principle, that's probably the third piece, which is I just don't find anything better than the 4 Scanlon principles. So manage by principle and follow those 4 principles.
Would you make any comment about the Scanlon Leadership Network and how that supports being a leader?
Yes, to me, it's incredibly important, and it was a factor in my choosing to come to Thomson-Shore because I knew that Thomson-Shore was located in Michigan, and it was difficult being in Virginia and participating with the network. And by being closer, I knew I had more access to other CEOs and people I could network with, learn from, and bounce things off of, and that's all facilitated through the network. The other thing that really helps us at Thomson-Shore is we can really take benefit in the conferences and the networking of our employees with other companies. And so there's a great deal of benefit that we get from participating in different events and learning through things that the network sponsors.
This will be my last question for you. As you sent me some material for this interview, there was an ending paragraph of your thoughts that I thought was wonderful, and I just have a piece of it here, but this really struck me. This is a quote from you. Scanlon is a tough, demanding way to run a business and not a touchy-feely, permissive experiment. I'd like you to comment on that.
A lot of people in Scanlon organizations, when something happens, they'll say, well, that's not very Scanlon-like. And that's my term, touchy-feely, that it's a soft approach. You know, we're all about giving love and hugs. That's not the case at all. To me, Scanlon is facing up to reality. And first you have to understand it. There's a lot of tough stuff that has to be done when you deal with reality. You're fighting to put in balance something that does not want to be in balance, and that's that equity triangle. There's pulls from each side, each constituency, and there's tough decisions that have to be made. And hopefully you can involve people correctly and helping to make those decisions. But it's not easy to do. And I think being a participative organization following Scanlon principles is much more difficult than just opening up a union contract and saying, you know, Article 3, Paragraph 2 says this is what we're going to do.
And yet, even though it's a challenge, I have no doubt you'd respond that it's worth it.
It's absolutely worth it because the greatest thing is to see people grow, achieve things that they never thought was possible. I'm reminded we just had a retirement recently, and when I was talking to the lady that was leaving the organization, she said, you know, after 26 years here, what I remember most are all the people and the customers that I worked with, and it's the relationships that I formed. I don't really remember that much about what we did in 1978, but I do remember who I was working with and the children that they had, the problems that they had, and how we overcame them. And so I think it's a lot about relationships and people and seeing them grow and provide for their families.
I want to segue something that's coming to me from this. You did comment that Scanlon is not touchy-feely, permissive. It's a tough, demanding way of doing a business. To me, the warm emotions that can come from, that you hear from people who are part of a business that runs it with a Scanlon plan and process improvement, is this, that you develop a respect, you develop a caring and an understanding for each other that is a very much, I guess, I'd almost call it a form of love in a very deep way. If you really get down to it, I think that's what love is. It's respect, it's caring. That happens in a Scanlon process. At least that's what's coming to me.
And I see Scanlon and servant leadership so well married together. When I talk about a belief in people and servant leadership, you lead by serving. Those two go hand in hand. And Scanlon will build servant leaders, and I think servant leaders do very well in using the Scanlon principles.
You've been listening to one of the Scanlon Leadership Network interview series. I'd like to thank our guest, Myron Marsh, for being with us. This interview series about leadership and Scanlon business principles is brought to you by the Scanlon Leadership Network and Foundation, a nonprofit association of high-performance, values-led organizations. Scanlon, where the best ideas come together. For information on the services offered by the Scanlon Leadership Network, visit their website at www.scanlonleader.org. That's on the web at scanlonleader.org. Scanlon is spelled S-C-A-N-L-O-N. Or call 517-332-8927. That's 517-332-8927. That's our interview for today. The great Scanlon leader, D.J. Dupree, taught us that every meeting with another human being should be what he called a fortuitous encounter. We are all children of God. We all have competencies and talents. The fact that we came together should make a difference. Here's wishing that all your encounters are indeed fortuitous. I'm Ron Duffy, and on behalf of the Scanlon Leadership Network, thanks for listening.